So today I'd like to go ahead and take a look at another method of thinking about editing portraits. So when we were in class earlier this week, I wanted to remind you that it's best to shoot portraits with as much depth of field as you can because today I'm going to show you how to fake a shallow depth of field. Now, let's talk about portraits. Now, I do a lot of portraiture photography, and I usually try to find a connection with the character. And this is my old neighbor from Arroyo Grande High School, from Arroyo Grande. And the first time I moved in on the street, he came across the street dressed like this with the shirt off, and I thought I was going to get my rear end kicked around the street a little bit. But probably one of the nicest guys that I've ever met, became really good friends. But what I really liked about Robbie is that he's just a character. You can tell that he's into tattoos, he's into piercings, he's very expressive. But what I really like about this as well is kind of the juxtaposition with his race car in the background, because aside from his regular job, he is actually a circle track racer and he races down at the Santa Maria Speedway. So I wanted to kind of create a portrait that reflected that sense of Robbie's character, that shows both his kind of very outward, kind of boisterous character with his tattoos and his presentation, but then also coupled with something else that we didn't really know about him to give us more info on the individual. So this is a basic edit right out of Camera Raw. I've already mapped my shadows, my midtones, and my highlights. I've already done my color balance. I haven't done any cropping on this image yet. So now let's take a look at a way that we can go ahead and do some post-processing edits inside Photoshop. And remember, what we're doing now is post-processing edits on a copy of that image that we were working on in a raw format. So again, we're never actually damaging the original file. So first thing, remember that you're going to do whenever you're working in Photoshop or Photopea is you're going to go ahead and take this background layer, drag it down to the Create New Layer icon to go ahead and duplicate it. Okay? And that's really important. Once I've got that duplicated, now I can continue to work on this top layer. So first thing I want to do is I want to try and recreate a shallow depth of field, a blurry field of focus. And when I'm doing this, I'm primarily thinking about the car in the background. I won't be paying attention to what's happening to Robbie, because in the next step, you're going to see that I will mask Robbie back into focus. And I'll explain how masking works here in a few. All right, so taking a look at this, with the layer selected, I'm going to go up to Filter, and I'm going to pull down to Blur, and then Gaussian Blur. You'll see this little dialog pop up, and right now we have a radius. Right now the radius is set to 1 pixels, and that's really low. We want to create an effective blur for this image, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to grab that radius slider, and notice now that I can see that that car is dropping out of focus. And my goal here is not to make it super blurry out of focus. Something like this is not going to look believable. We're trying to create a believable shallow depth of field as if it was done in a camera. So I'm going to give it about 6.4 pixels. Get in the habit of clicking this preview box off and on so that you can go ahead and preview how it looked before and after. And I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to hit OK. So here now, if we take a look at our layers palette, we have a copy of Robbie on top that is out of focus, and then one that is in focus, which is the locked background. So let me remind you how layers work. It's like you're sitting in front of a table, and on that table you have 2 copies of this photo stacked on top of one another. The one on top is blurry, the one underneath is clear. So let's take a look at how we can fix this. We're going to use a technique called masking. And you probably heard me say the other day, last week, that the primary strengths to Photoshop are layers, selections, and masking. So let's go ahead and take a look at masking. With this layer selected, I'm going to come down to the bottom of the layers palette. You can see this icon right here, and it says Add Layer Mask. I'm going to click on that, and notice now a new icon pops up in that layer. And notice that there's a little chain right here. This indicates that this mask is linked to the data in this layer. Other thing that's important to note, I want you to pay attention. You can also see that the box for the mask is highlighted, showing that's where you're at in the layer. If I go over here, you can see I would be working on the data, but here I would be working on the mask for this layer. So always pay attention to what you're on as far as layers and make sure you're on the correct mask. Now here's how masking works. I can use the paintbrush to paint with different opacities of black and white. Black reveals, or it will put a hole in the image, allowing me to see through to the image underneath. So for example's sake, let's take a look. I'm going to do a big one here. And let's make sure I'm on black. And notice that when I click on that, I applied black to the mask. So basically, it removes all the blurring in this area and we're seeing through to the clear image underneath. Now, this doesn't look believable because notice that the car in the background has fallen back into focus. So I'm going to back up one step. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to go ahead and change the opacity of my brush. So black reveals, white hides. I'm going to put this to about 25% right in this range. And each click, when I click and hold and then swipe, it brings it back into focus. Now I want you to pay attention to what happens over here on the mask. As I click and add and add and add and add, you can see it's bringing him into focus here, and it's also showing us where the masking is taking place, so we have a reference for that. Try and size your brush accordingly when you're actually masking. That way you don't have to go back and do too much counter masking to fix any areas that you brought back in to focus by accident. Now let's take a look here. I want to make sure that I get this arm completely in focus right in here. Now when I am working this way, I kind of like to pay attention to what's actually in focus. And for this image, I like having the focus start to fall off right about mid-length at his pants. So what I'm going to do here is, you're going to see me come up here, I'm going to click and hold, and I'm going to come all the way down and release. And then I'm going to click and hold and come halfway down and release, and then click and hold and come down again. That way I get a gradual fall off of focus down here. If you see areas that need more, just go in and add in a little bit more. Now, one of the things I want to remind you, I'm using a soft brush. Remember, we saw the difference between a soft brush and a hard brush. We want to make sure that our editing is pretty much hidden or not seen at all. All right, so this looks pretty good so far, but now I want to zoom in and take you back and show you the areas that I missed. And this is because I let the brush go past the edge. And I'm pointing this out because when you start masking on an image, it's probably going to require that you're going to have to go back because that feathered edge gets past the actual edge of your subject a little bit. So let's take a look. Let's zoom in. Remember, I can hold spacebar temporarily to switch to the hand tool, and that allows me to click and hold and drag the image around to wherever I want. So notice now that right up here, this area is in focus here, a little bit right here on the hood of the car, right here on the text. So I'm going to switch to white now by clicking on this little arrow. And remember, you can also just hit the X key on the keyboard to go back and forth. Now remember, black reveals, white hides. So in this case, I'm going to crank this all the way back up to 100% opacity, and I'm going to zoom in. And additionally, I'm actually going to increase the hardness of my brush to about 78%. That way, I can get relatively close without it bleeding onto him. So I don't want him to fall back out of focus. And notice as I go over that, it's masking that area back in so it's out of focus. Always size your brush accordingly to get into small areas like this when you can. Notice I'm going right along that edge. Let's do a little bit more up in here. Looks like I need to do a little bit alongside his face here as well. Okay. A little bit of issues over here, so let's come in and make sure that this is all out of focus again, sizing that brush accordingly. I don't like that little bit of light back there behind his ear. So we'll take a look at a way to fix that using a selection like we learned on Monday. Yeah, it's a little light source back there that's causing that little specular highlight to pop up. So again, notice I'm just kind of going right up along that edge. Again, trying to make sure that everything falls back out of focus like it should. You have to have pretty steady eye-to-hand coordination. And also, when I'm using the mouse, I'm moving slow, but I'm also applying more pressure downward on the mouse, actually on my palm on the table. So if I apply that pressure, it allows me a little bit more control so I can move slower. This will allow you to get much more detailed masking and repairs whenever you're editing your images. All right, let's take a look here. All right, so right here, this is really obvious in here. So we definitely have to fix this. So again, you can see it's important to zoom in after you've done any kind of post-processing as far as trying to do a fake depth of field. That's really important. So I want this all to look believable all the way through like we took it with just the camera. As I'm doing this, does anybody have any questions while I continue to kind of back mask the areas and touch up? Anybody at all? If you have a question, just say it out loud, please.
Can you repeat how we make the brush smaller?
I sure can. So there's a couple of ways. I've been using the keystrokes on the keyboard, which are the bracket keys, and those are located adjacent to the P key on the right-hand side of your keyboard. Oops, it's got off my brush. So notice I can go up and down. Also, when you have the brush selected, don't forget about your toolbar options up here at the top. Photo P has this as well. So whenever you select a tool, options for that tool appear up here. So if I want to, I could go to the pull down right here to define the size as well and the hardness. Does that answer that for you?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions while I finish this up? That's not too bad. Try and move a little bit faster so I don't burn up too much time today. You guys should take your time when you're doing your edits, however, because you want it to look nice and believable. Notice how this jack stand and stuff back here is kind of in focus, and also along that arm. And I believe there was an area right here as well. That grill right there. And again, notice I'm keeping that brush right up against his arm. And again, what are we doing? We're creating a fake depth of field. We're creating a shallow depth of field so that when we show this image, that all the emphasis will be on the character. Because the eye, everybody's eye, your eye, my eye, will always go to what's in focus first. Just like if there's text in your image, your viewing audience will read the text first. It's just the way that we've been programmed all the way up from grade school, like seeing a stop sign and knowing exactly what it is. Put this chain down here. Okay, so that looks pretty good overall now. So notice now, let me remind you the benefits of doing this. Remember, I'm working on a top copy here, so we're not damaging this bottom one. We've applied a layer mask to this top copy. And remember, layer mask allows you to paint on top of this layer mask physically on the image using the paintbrush, using black to reveal or white to hide. So in essence, what is happening right here in the layers palette, we're creating a hole in the blurry image, allowing us to see through this hole to the areas that are in focus on the background. So now that I've got that done, let's take a look at a few more things. So I'm showing you the way that I approach editing, and everybody's style of editing is going to be different from one to another because we all have personal preferences and likes. So one of the things I want to show you that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and combine these two layers now so that I have the shallow depth of field image all contained in one. To do that, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on the little menu and I'm going to come down to flatten image. Now for you, if you were using Photopea, you would need to go to the layer menu at the top and then come down to flatten image. Notice that when I do that, it combines all the edits into one single layer. Now, I'm going to duplicate that layer again so I can continue to work on this image. So what I'm showing you now is some kind of stylistic stuff that I like to do. One of the things I like to do is I like to add a lot of black into my image. I like a lot of contrast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this background copy again. Notice I have 2 copies now. And with this top copy selected, I'm going to go up to Image, Adjustments, and come down to Desaturate. Okay, so what it's going to do is it's going to turn that into a black and white image. Now, look at the layers palette. We still have our other color images here, okay? But we have this black and white out the top. If I turn that off and on, you can see that very clearly. So let's think back to what we did the other day with the eyes when we worked on the Jed portrait. We were in fact going in and brightening and whitening, but we were also working with blending modes. So again, let me remind you, from within the layers palette, with this layer selected, I'm going to go to the blending mode pull down. And notice that if I go through these blending modes, it shows me how it's going to blend black with that image underneath. For me, I prefer overlay because it still gives me relatively good skin tones and it gives me a really deep black overall in the image. And I prefer this kind of shadowy kind of image. Now, this is too dark. So I'm going to go to the layers palette and change the opacity of this black and white layer. Come up to opacity. I'm going to bring this down and I'm thinking right about 70%. So I can turn that off and on to see how that's affecting the image. I like how that looks. It's got a lot more impact. Now, another thing that I want to go back to, we looked at this earlier this week on how to whiten the teeth and whiten the eyes for portraits. I'm going to use that same technique to go ahead and to lighten or darken Robbie's tattoos to bring more attention to them, as well as to lighten up the right side of his face a little bit. I'm going to back this off a little bit. The more I look at it, I think I like it with less. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So I'll remind you that trick I told you, the soft light trick, we start by creating an empty layer on top. Now I'm going to go to my blend mode and we're going to change that layer to soft light. Now remember, this allows me to paint with black or white, black to darken or white to lighten. So in this case, let's look at lightening. I'm going to switch to white. I'm going to grab my opacity. I'm going to set that to about 10% and I want to zoom in on his face. Let's make sure that brush is 100% soft. And now I'm going to do a couple clicks through here just to lighten up that shadow on that eye. Might open that eye up a little bit too. A couple clicks on his goatee here to show a little bit more of that goatee. So I'm kind of masking back, or not masking back, but lightening the areas that got a little bit too dark when I did the black and white background copy. Now, here on his arm, right here, I think that we can go ahead and actually darken the tattoo a little bit. So I'm going to come through here. I switched to black, notice, and notice how that cleans up his skin tone by darkening. Notice that he wears a tank top all the time here, so I can probably come in and use this trick to go ahead and darken that skin tone a little bit to make it look more believable. Watch what happens here. You're going to see some more color saturation come in skin tone. Okay, so that looks pretty good overall. I've darkened the tattoos a little bit. So I'm going to change the size of my brush and switch back to white. And I'm going to come in here and lighten these. These are his children's handprints that he has tattooed on his stomach. Also notice that he has the theater mask. So what am I really doing? I'm really trying to emphasize all the things that create Robbie as a character or a portrait. And so obviously the tattoos, he's into tattoos, and those are a big thing in his life. All right, that's looking pretty good overall. pretty happy with that, but there's some distracting things. Don't like this top edge up here. I really don't like this. So let's take a look first at cropping this image. Now remember, you can crop inside both the Lightroom app or Photopea or in Photoshop. I'm going to grab the crop tool right here. And right now, I want to make sure it's set to a 1-to-1 ratio so I maintain the square format that I have. So that means I can grab any corner and it's going to maintain that ratio. So I'm going to grab a corner, come down a little bit, and notice I can click and hold that image and kind of drag it in here a little bit to see how I want to crop it. I can also go ahead and use the arrow keys if I want to go ahead and move this image subtly. So I'm thinking right about there looks pretty good. If I'm happy with that, I could hit enter or return, or I could go ahead and hit this check mark up here to commit myself to that edit. Now, I don't like this. It's distracting. So let's take a look at that. Remember some of the repair tools that we used in Photopea? We have those same repair tools here in Photoshop. Now, one that I didn't show on Photopea that I want to show you now is this one called the Clone Stamp tool. I'm going to click that, and notice at the top, this all adjusts to show me the options available for this tool. The tool is a brush, okay? And with that brush, I have options for size, opacity, hardness, all that, just like we do for any other brush. However, with this tool, I need to define where I want to pull the texture from to repair this area. So this tool is an option, click, define tool. Now, what does that mean? That means that I'm going to hold option right now, and notice that it turns the brush into a target. And then I'm going to click with the mouse and then let go of option. Now, when I come over here to clone, whoops, I need to be on the right layer. This is a good example of that not happening. In fact, let's flatten this image and work on a copy since I did a bunch of edits. So this is an option define tool. I'm going to click and release, and then I'm going to come over here and notice that it's pulling texture and color from the areas where I option define. And it's always best to go ahead and try and choose an area that's relatively close to the area you're trying to repair. So for instance, I'll come over here, hold option, and then release, and then come across. And notice that little target moves with the brush. It's letting me know where it's actually pulling that data from. Let's take a look at this now. I like that a lot better, far less distracting from there to there. So again, always be thinking about how you can improve this. Now, the last thing, and again, this is personal preference that I'm going to do, is I'm going to vignette this image. And I'm going to do that by simply using the soft light layer trick that I showed you earlier this week and just a few moments ago. And I'm going to choose my brush and I'm going to switch to black. And now I'm going to go ahead and darken these corners. And I'm going to turn this up to about 23%, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit because I'm really just concentrating on the corners here. And notice that with each click, it's going to get darker and darker. My goal is to make kind of Robbie stand out, but to give this image a little bit of more depth in this regard. And we do that with vignetting, we do that with lighting, we do that with editing, we do that with composition and how we set it up. All right, so I like the way that looks. A little dark down here. Don't forget, we can go over to our layers palette and adjust the opacity of this layer. I'm going to take that all the way out and then bring it in slowly until I get the desired effect that I'm looking for. I'm thinking right about there. And again, notice that I'm turning that layer off and on so I can preview before and after, and I like how that looks. All right, so there's one last step that I want to go ahead and do. I want to go ahead and make sure that this image is in focus. Now, when we are shooting in raw images, realize that the data from the sensor has not been edited in any shape or form like it would be if you'd shot a JPEG. When you shoot with a JPEG, the camera automatically makes all these decisions for you for contrast, vibrance, hue and saturation, shadows, midtones, highlights, clarity, sharpness, contrast. It does all of that. Okay, but when we shoot in raw format like I did with this image, the image has not been sharpened. And you see that I did not do any sharpening in Lightroom the last couple weeks because I like to do my sharpening in Photoshop. So let's take a quick look at how to go and finish up this image. We always should sharpen. Make sure that in the layers palette I have my image selected, and I'm going to zoom in quite a bit, and let's take a look so we can see Robbie. And now I'm going to use a filter. I'm going to go up to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. This has been a favorite sharpening filter in Photoshop probably for about 25 years. There are many different types, but this one really gives you the amount of control that you want and need. I'm going to click on that. Notice a dialog pops up, and we're presented with three options or three sliders: the amount, the radius, and the threshold. So let's understand what these do. The amount is the strength of the filter as it sharpens the image. The radius defines how many pixels it sharpens or increases the contrast of an edge. So right now it's set to 1 pixel. So that means that anything it defines as an edge will be sharpened half a pixel on the left and half a pixel on the right. Now, the threshold defines that there must be so many differences between 1 pixel to the next before it can be sharpened. So this kind of protects us from over sharpening and degrading the image. Now, the equation that I would have you start with always is 80% and 4 for the amount and 4 for the threshold. That's a great starting point for you. Now, I usually work between 80 and 110%. And as far as my radius, depending on the image, between 4 and 8 pixels, and the threshold, I'm generally between 4 and 10 in this range. But a good all-around starting point for any beginning student would be 80 and then 4 and then 4. Notice preview checkbox. Let's turn that off and on and pay attention to his face. Also look at his tattoos and everything else that we see there. We're trying to determine, is this too much sharpening? Because you can over sharpen an image quite a bit. And notice that when I cranked the strength of that filter up, it really degraded it. I could go even further with the radius. So you can see that having a gentler touch, or that idea that less is more, is very important. Again, your goal is always to edit the image so that no one knows that you did. I think that looks pretty good at 84 and 4. I'm going to go OK. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out and just do one quick look. All right, let's say I'm happy with this image and I need to submit it to Mr. Clark's class. I know that I cannot turn in PSDs into Google Classroom. Okay, so let's take a quick look at how to go ahead and save this as a JPEG. So first thing I will do is I will flatten my image. I will come to File, and I will come down to Save As. You're going to see this dialog pop up: save the cloud documents or save on your computer. I say save on your computer. I'll do mine on my desktop, and right now it's entitled Robbie.psd Photoshop document is what that stands for. So I want to change the format right here from the pull down. Notice that we have many different formats here. The one that we're going to use always is going to be JPEG. Now this is only for submitting online. You should always keep a copy of your image in Photoshop format, okay, because those are the images that we will want to print with. Now when we go ahead and choose JPEG, JPEG is actually a lossy form of compression. What it's going to do is it's going to evaluate the image overall for colors and similar like values. And if there's 10 blues, it's going to say, hey, this blue and that blue are pretty similar. Let's put this down to about 6 blues. So you probably won't see that as much with portraits, but you'll definitely see that the image will degrade when you shoot beautiful sunsets. You'll see banding happening in the sky. So now I've got this saved as a JPEG, and then I can continue to work and then go ahead and pop up and upload my new images. So I want to remind you guys that this assignment is due. Let me end right there. Let's save this. Fake depth of field, desktop.